Okay, so here in lesson number 4, we're going to build on the lesson 3 application we created where we designed the user interface to basically add up two numbers and give us the result. So essentially we have our add button, and this is going to be the button that the user presses in order to do the addition operation or the addition event. And so if we actually double click on this add button, what it does is it creates an event handler and a block of code here, called like button add click, right? So the name of the button is called button_add, and this is a click event. And so what's basically happening here is when the user presses this add button on the form, when the application is running, it will run this code that is inside of this button click event. All right, so I just want to make sure you understand that. That's pretty much how .NET applications, or even just in general, Windows Forms applications work. You have a form, you have controls on the form, such as inputs here, like these text boxes, and then you have buttons, and you can create events that will execute code when the user interacts with certain controls on this form. That's just basic Windows logic for Windows desktop application programming. All right, so underneath the hood here, this is where we're going to actually start writing some code. Well, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to get the numbers from the text boxes. So there's a variety of different types of data types or variable types inside of C# that you can work with. Now, I'm going to start explaining the raw fundamentals of different data types here in a second, but I just want you to see from start to finish in this first few lessons of how to make an application so your mind can wrap around from start to finish how to make a very basic application. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually, whenever you write a C# statement, you have to, like in this case, I'm going to declare a variable. So I'm going to say string, and you're declaring the data type. So string, int for integer, double for like a number with decimals, etc. And so here I'm just going to say value1 equals text. And now, this is a fundamental thing. If you need to pause the video and take a look at this or look at this in your sample code, here is the most powerful thing in Visual Studio. If I did not have IntelliSense in Visual Studio, I don't know if I'd ever be a programmer anymore. So Visual Studio is fantastic in that it has a predictive, basically typing based on what you're starting to type, or what is called IntelliSense. So it intelligently senses what you're trying to type, and it like sort of previews what it thinks you're trying to go after. And this is why I was telling you in the previous video why you should name your buttons and your text boxes and things like that with a standard naming convention, especially in alphabetical order, so that way you can quickly get to those. Now, if I just press enter here, it's going to fill in the rest, so it saves a little bit of typing. And I'm trying to get the text property of that text box control, or that text box thing on the form. So to get to that, I just say dot text, and now I'm getting the text field on the text box control. Now, every C# statement is pretty much going to end with a semicolon at the end. So here, notice there's no errors. If I actually come up here to build solution, everything works okay, and there are no errors. So basically what I'm doing is I'm getting the value of the text box here for text box number 1, and I'm assigning it to a variable here inside of my code called value. And let's actually call this value1. So I'm actually just going to copy this text, so we can select it all and just say copy, so we don't have to type over and over again. We'll do a new line by hitting enter on our keyboard. We'll paste that. And if we actually left this alone, you'll see here that Visual Studio puts a red squiggly line underneath value1. And that's because we've already declared value1 before. And so we can't declare the same variable name again twice. We can reassign it to a different value, but we can't declare it again twice. So we're going to go ahead and say value2. We're going to change this to text box number 2. And so it's going to add these two values together. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and say label. And then notice here there's label number 1, label number 2, and then label underscore result. Again, IntelliSense is saving the day here, making coding easy for me. So we'll say label result text field is going to equal the value1 plus value2. Okay, so basically what I've done here is I'm extracting and getting the text values from text box number 1 and 2, and then I'm going to set the label result text field to be adding those two fields together. So these first two lines of code are actually getting variables from the UI, and then this is actually setting a value on the UI. All right, so let's go ahead and say build solution, and then I'm just going to go ahead and press play here. And when I press the add button, basically what will happen is these two value 1 and value 2s will be added together, and it should change the result. And it did, but I didn't fill anything in. So let's say 34, 50, or 56, 456, say add. And here we go. We've got 34, 456, but that's not what we intended. So what this actually did in this code, this is a great example. I love to show people this because so that way they understand data types and what's going on. Well, by default, here, I can actually type all sorts of stuff, right? So if I press add, what is actually happening with this value 1 plus value 2 is it's adding these two strings or concatenating them together. So it's stringing those two separate strings and combining them together with this plus sign here. All right, so we're going to actually need to change this to intentionally turn these into integers. Now, text fields are, if you hover over this text field, you'll see the IntelliSense actually tells you that the data type that it returns is a string. So you see that basically string sort of like in a blue or cyan color at the left. The text box text control field will actually return a string value, so this, and we need to actually convert these into integers. So watch this. I'm going to go ahead and say int. And so basically int is there's different types of int, like for different basically sizes in memory. Just to keep things simple from a programming point of view, you almost always use int, which will, I believe defaults to int 32, 32-bit integer inside of C#. So basically you'll use this data type. So instead of string, we're going to switch this to int. And you'll notice right away that Visual Studio is bombing out, right? Like it's reporting some errors. So if we hover this, it says cannot implicitly convert string to integer. So this is what's great about Visual Studio. Usually when you mess up on code, like Visual Studio is going to tell you, hey, you can't do that. So let's even build this solution and see what it does. It reports 3 different errors to us. Cannot implicitly convert string to int. Okay, so good. We need to somehow convert these strings from the text box, and we need to go ahead and convert those. So we're going to say int dot parse, and then basically this is a method or a function, this parse. You'll see here that the Visual Studio will actually tell you the format of what needs to happen. So what this int.parse method is doing is it's converting a string value that's inside parentheses here, and it's trying to convert that and return an integer data type. So we'll just close that in parentheses, and we'll do the same thing down here, int.parse, and then we'll do an open parentheses and then close parentheses, and then there we go. Notice that the squiggly lines go away. Now, the problem here is that notice that label result.text is still showing an error. It can't convert an integer to string. So we did convert value 1 and 2 to integers, and we're going to add those two values up, but now we actually need this to go over into the text box for the label as a string. So we're going to put parentheses around value 1 and 2, and there's this wonderful, simple toString method here, or function. And basically what that'll do is it'll take any string or any number value and convert it to a string data type and return that to the label text field here. Okay, so you can pause that, study this code if you need to, but if I go ahead and say build, that we can see that everything built, there's no errors. We'll do our debug, and we'll type in 4 plus 5, and we'll say add, and there we go. We now have 9. Now what happens if I came in here and I started typing this? Well, we're going to actually get an unhandled exception. So there's an error because an invalid data type was passed to this int.parse. I can't pass a character like a DFDDDD, and I cannot convert that to an integer. So this is a case when we actually get later on in the training where we could put an exception handler in here that would not allow anything but integers to be input into that dialog box, so strings wouldn't be passed, and we wouldn't have this error or this exception be thrown. All right, so let's just go ahead and stop our code if that happens. So there's this stop button up here at the top, which will stop debugging, or if you go underneath debug and you say stop debugging, that'll kill your application and stop that there. But in the basic instance here, we basically just created a simple addition app. In lesson 3, we created the UI and the inputs and where we're going to display the results. And here we actually did the code that when this button is clicked, this code underneath that event handler will execute and add the two numbers together and return the string to the label.